In 1749, Charles Wesley wrote a hymn that impacted the church for time and for eternity. Little did he know that that hymn, "I Want a Principle Within," would become the foundation for one man who had impacted his world for Christian education. That man was Stephen Douglas Herron.
And our only hope is in our homes, our churches, and our schools to somehow counteract this diabolical effort to destroy our young people, our children. My heart goes out. And God can see us through today, but I want to tell you something. He's not going to do it while we're sitting around selfishly squandering on ourselves and neglecting our children and failing to see that they get a Christian education.
Over and over, Uncle Rob emphasized that he wanted to provide a place where people moving to Florida could have some spiritual influence, and still with the view of evangelism, and to raise up a place where holiness would be emphasized and where people could come for a place of refreshment and rest. And he particularly emphasized missionaries coming from the field who needed to recharge their batteries, to find rest for both body, soul, and spirit. Uncle Rob bought the property, the first property in West Palm Beach in 1946, and chartered what was at first called Florida Evangelistic Association in the fall of 1946. And Uncle Rob bought an estate, quite a large estate with quite a number of acres. But that first year he had Christmas Vespers, and if I'm not mistaken, it was Tony Anderson, Dr. Tony Anderson, who was the speaker. However, Uncle Rob soon saw that that was not going to be an adequate place. It was within the city limits. While it was a large place as far as for family living, it was far too small for what he envisioned could happen. And we were closed in by the city. Bordering the intercoastal waterway were plots of 30 acres, plots of ground, 30 acres. And he bought one of those for the enormous price of $4,800. Good part of the land was swampy. It was not attractive at all. In fact, we laugh and talk about, my dad was a pioneer as well as my Uncle Rob. But when Dad first looked at the place, he said, "Rob, did God or the devil tell you to come here?"
That's the main thing about it. Well, that was something. That's bush country.
Palmetto.
They had to cut bush and stuff to even get in there.
Over a period of time, enough of the land was cleared to move some buildings in, and though the first building on these grounds was a building that came from a military camp about 6 miles down the road, Camp Murphy. Actually, if you know where to look, you can still see machine gun emplacements in Jonathan Dickinson Park, where Camp Murphy was located.
My wife and I, we came down in 1958 and drove a 58 Impala Chevy down to the camp meeting. And we drove into the place. I thought, oh my goodness, where are we? We come down the sandy roads, and but get into the services, you didn't worry about the sand and everything.
I can remember going to see Brother French one time because we worked together mowing the grass and taking care of the property. And I had a breakdown with the Gravely tractor, so I went down to see Brother French. And I remember during that year, Brother French and Sister French had been up in revival meetings in New York and in Pennsylvania. And while they were gone, we took advantage of their absence to make things a little more comfortable for Brother French. And so Brother Carroll and different ones, we donated money, and we wanted to put inside plumbing into their little cabin down there. So we put in a bathroom and wash basin, wash tub, bathtub, and toilet in a section of their cottage, and to make it much more convenient. And I remember when Brother French got back, he apologized all over himself for us doing that for him, that we should not have done it, and they really didn't need it, and they really didn't want it. But he nevertheless was gracious and thanked us for it. So this day I went to the house to visit and to tell him I needed parts for the Gravely tractor. And that day I went in, and I noticed that the bathtub was filled with old newspapers about 3 foot high. And while I was there, Sister French walked outside to the pitcher pump on the outside to get her water, and they were not using the facilities. And Brother French told me, he said, "Royden," he said, "we just have it too good." He said, "Last night," he said, "God spoke to me in the nighttime and said, Rob, there are people that love God just as much as you do that don't have a decent bed to sleep on tonight. There's people on the other side of the world that need Christ and need the gospel, while you have this soft bed to sleep on." And he said, "I got out of the bed, and he said, I spent the rest of the night sleeping on the wooden floor." That's the type of sacrifice that today to us would be considered almost off the wall. It would be just something bizarre that we would think people would be so eccentric to even consider that. But that's the type of people that God built Hobe Sound Camp and FEA Ministries on, people that were sacrificial, disciplined themselves, and literally slept with the world on their heart and on their shoulders.
My uncle prayed more than any man I ever knew. He was a prayer. There's nothing that would characterize Hobe Sound more than prayer as the leading aspect. Saturdays from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon he spent in his cabin to pray, and it was open for anybody.
Seabreeze Camp was a central part of my spiritual life and an integral part of our family life, both my family when I was home with my parents and then when my wife Alice and I were married. I remember one night in particular, Tony Anderson, Dr. T.M. Anderson, was one of the evangelists. I think he's a Bible teacher. But anyway, it was warm. We were having some real global warming in those days. And the tabernacle was hot. And we were having the preliminaries. And the prayer time was one of those times when prayer kind of catches fire and goes beyond just the formal leading of prayer by the person that's called to the microphone to lead in prayer. The spirit of prayer was quite prevalent across the congregation. And Dr. Anderson had stepped out back, to get just a breath of fresh air. It was in the old Second Tabernacle, what is now the Smool Center. And Brother Anderson came back in, and you could tell, I noticed him, he was visibly shaken. In fact, he seemed a little bit pale. And he stepped up to the microphone and asked for attention, and people kind of paused a minute. And he said, "Folks," he said, "I saw Jesus standing at the top of this tabernacle with his arms outstretched. And he said, "Tony, tell them that anybody can have anything they can believe me for tonight." And folks, that service really, now you want to talk about holy pandemonium. It broke open. And I remember looking down the aisle, down the seat, the bench, the row where I was sitting, and a lady was there who had a goiter about the size of a large orange or a small grapefruit. And soon after Brother Anderson made that statement, she reached up and put her hand on that goiter, and it disappeared under her hand as I was watching. I just saw it just completely disappear. People that night received help from the Lord in areas of personal victory, and they've been defeated for years and were able to truly believe God to deliver them and to bring them through to real spiritual victory.
The story of Hobe Sound is about how God worked through the life and labors of Dr. S.D. Herron and others to establish Hobe Sound Bible College, and how that vision continues today.
In 1960, actually previous to that time, Dr. Herron had approached my uncle about starting a Bible school here, and that actually began in 1960.
This was the dream of my husband and myself. God told us to come and kept impressing us. And we found out that we could use the campground, and so we made preparations and came. We came from Knoxville, Tennessee at that time, and we owned a beautiful brick house on a beautiful lot, and the church that we were pastoring furnished the house. And what we did, it was ours, so we sold it, and we moved to Florida in the Pepto-Bismol pink house. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom you had to back in and back out, no cabinets, no heat, nothing. Mr. Carroll fixed it up a little bit for us.
They talked about starting a school, and they wanted to see how much interest they could get, and they started taking up money, and I thought we took up around $30,000. Started taking up the money, it just seemed like the Lord just said to me, now you were going to buy a new car, and you've already got it ordered, and the seal strike was on, and they could not make your car, so why don't you just give it to the school? So I turned to my wife and I said, "Alberta, the Lord wants me to give this money that we're going to buy a new car with to the school." And she says, "Well, go ahead. If the Lord is asking you to do it, just go ahead and give it to the school." And I've always really glad I gave it to the school, because that old car would be in a junkyard now, and here we're having a Bible school, and we saw so many young people go through here, and we rejoice because we gave that money.
I met Brother Herron the first time as an evangelist at the Atwood Wesleyan Church in Louisville. I was immediately captivated by his mannerisms, the way he handled the word, and his patience with some of us that were slow to grasp. And he was a teaching preacher, and we enjoyed his ministry. He had mentioned that there were thoughts of them starting the school at the Seabreeze camp meeting, and wanted to know if I had any interest that way to let him know about it.
We were in his church in Knoxville, Tennessee for a missionary meeting, my parents and I, and he told us of his vision to start a Bible school. He and Brother French, Brother H. Rob French. and start a Bible school. He called it a boot camp, a spiritual boot camp for Christian workers, to only have those students that were really serious about full-time Christian ministry and soul winning, and didn't worry about the niceties, all the social interactions. Of course, in those early days, there was none. Should I say there were none? And but Brother Herron shared that with us, and I felt moved. I felt drawn to that idea of a real spiritual boot camp, a Christian workers boot camp.
Now, this is the first letter that I ever received from Dr. Herron, and it was a letter in which he was responding to my request for information about the school. Dear Brother Whitaker, Christian greetings. We were happy to receive your inquiry concerning the school. I'm enclosing a bulletin which I hope will supply the needed information. However, it is essentially what you have in the mimeographed form. If there are further questions, feel perfectly free to write me. For the next month, it would be better to address me at the address above, which of course was Pell City, Alabama. After that, write to Hobe Sound, Florida. There will be available some 2-room apartments, simply furnished, for about $30 per month, or for couples without families, we could arrange single rooms in one wing of the dormitory, and your wife could go to school also for the nominal sum of $310. Or, if she didn't take classes, a charge for her room and board would be $210. Thus, the charge for the two of you in school with room and board would be $620. Or if she did not take classes, $520. However, I would strongly advise her to take classes also.
I remember some of the old teachers and good teachers, Brother West, Brother French, and Brother Herron, Brother Rob French, and some of them that taught us, you know.
In the summer of 1960, we began making our preparation to head south, packed up our little 53 Chevy and loaded it with what few things we had. Joanna and I had been married less than a year. And started south with no interstate highways, just regular U.S. highways, and many, many hours of driving. We stopped overnight in Macon, Georgia, and then the next day drove to Hobe Sound. It was Wednesday. It was late at night when we got there. It was hot, steamy, September. I'd never been in Florida in September. We parked the car in front of what then was the Tabernacle, which is the cafeteria there now at the campus. But we waded through grass that was knee-deep and mosquitoes that were 3 feet deep. Brother Carroll said, if you'll just follow me. And again, no lights. The campus was as dark, pitch black. You couldn't see anything. So I got in my car, and he walked ahead of me slowly with a flashlight, and I followed him down to a little tiny cottage down on the lower part of the campus. It was one of those buildings that had been brought in from Camp Murphy. World War II buildings, tiny buildings. And he came and opened the door for us, and we stepped in. He flipped on the light, and palmetto bugs ran everywhere, up the walls, across the floor, across the bed. And my wife, without thinking, just screamed when she saw those huge palmetto bugs, which we had not seen before. And then the mosquitoes were swarming in as well, and this is where we were spending the first night. It was really exciting, and I'll never forget it, and nor will my wife. But we had quite a time. Sister Zook came down later with a little pan, like a paint pan and a roller, and she says, now I'm going to put this on the screens so that the sandflies won't bite you during the night. We thought, well, what are sandflies? But she rolled the screen of one of the windows, and then she went to the other window on the door and rolled it on there, and the screen fell out. And she just laughed. She thought it was so funny, but we weren't in a laughing mood that night.
I came to Hobe Sound Bible Institute, as it was called in the fall of 1961. We were living in Cuba at the time. And that's another story in itself, how I got out of Cuba. But I remember that I got to Key West, flew from Havana to Key West and took the bus to Miami, took another bus and got off the bus at the old Citgo station out where what is now Bridge Road and Highway 1 meet. Of course, it was just 2-lane in those days. Everything was closed up. It was 11:30 at night. Everything was closed solid. So I put my suitcases around behind the gas station, wasn't worried about them disappearing, and walked up to the campus. We had lived there for a while in 55 and 56 when my father was recovering from heart trouble. We'd lived on the campground, it later became the campus. So I knew my way around. I knew how to, so at about midnight, I found an open door to one of the cottages and went in and and crawled up in one of the beds without any, of course, out any bedding, and slept till morning. And then encountered Brother Herron and the others. But that was my first night at Hobe Sound as coming for school.
We left all the men that worked with me. We loaded up old truck and brought all the furniture down. And the first people we met that evening was Brother Herron and Sister Herron. And he left my furniture on the truck, and it rained that night. And you could wring the water out of the clothes. Out of the, the seats, the foam rubber seats. And Brother Herron came up and said, "You go and cry on my wife's shoulder." And so Brother Herron and us became pretty good friends. And I had an old pickup, and I bought a bunch of tools, and I probably made a big mistake. Because I'd been working 10 years since I'd been in school, and I won't come down here to really get an education. And I still don't have much. I've learned something. But I cut trees, helped them place trailers, and I laid the tiles on it in the dorm, men's dorm, and had a friend of mine who worked in a welding shop, his cousin, and built him a flower thing. I don't know if any of you remember or not. It was in the middle of the boys' dorm. And then Brother Herron and us would take my old pickup and we'd go down to West Palm and pick up supplies for the school.
The first buildings I mentioned came from Camp Murphy. However, for the school, there was a building projects began which really continued for at least a decade there. What is now known as the men's dormitory was the school building, as I mentioned before, where the girls were housed on one wing and the boys on the other wing, and there were classrooms in the center.
If I remember correctly, school started in toward the end of September, so we had a week or two where we were doing the sheetrock work on the old boys' dorm. Well, actually, it was the dormitory. One wing was boys and the other wing was girls. And we were working long hours. Of course, nobody was keeping hours. It was all working toward getting ready and getting school ready to start.
That soon was outgrown, and that building became the men's dormitory and a girls' dormitory. Women's dormitory was built. Then the classrooms took place largely in the other buildings, the tabernacle and other buildings around the grounds.
There's a room in the men's dormitory at the foot of the stairs. One time was a library. And we all gathered in there, about 17 of us, and Dr. Herron did not have a chalkboard. He certainly didn't have a whiteboard. The things that we have today and take for granted, we just didn't have. And so he had an old green painted chalkboard, which he stood up on a chair, sat up on a chair, propped it up against the wall. It had a hole in it. I remember that very clearly. And that he wrote on there the first schedule that I ever saw. This is when the classes meet, and these are the classes that are being offered. And we then took our cards and filled out those cards and registered for our first classes.
And the first year they wanted us to, students, we went over to Bahamas. First year of school was 7 months. And there was about 16 of us, I believe. Some went to High Rock and some went to, Home Truck. And we sort of got together, but first year, Sister Burris had been praying for 20 years for God to send somebody over there to help her people. And I don't know why, but the Lord spoke to my heart in South Carolina, and I was riding the machine, eating dust, and the tears rolling down my eyes after I was saved, and I landed on the island, and students would give out tracts.
Well, the unique personalities that God brought together, all of us had different backgrounds. All of us had our little prejudices one way and another. It ought to be this, it ought to be that. But it was amazing. Brother French started it. Once a year, we all had to come together and humble ourselves in front of each other. Oh, I dreaded those meetings because we would get together and we would confess our faults openly. We would forgive one another. We would move on. And I think that, along with great wisdom, was the oil that kept things lubricated. Many, many times we could have had factions and schisms and things, but they didn't happen while I was there. And I think Brother Herron's leadership, of course, and then Brother French's emphasis upon grieving the Holy Ghost. We're not to do anything that would grieve the Spirit of God. And that hovers over me today.
I'll never forget the day after day as Brother Herron, Dr. Herron as he was later called, would come to chapel and share with us from his devotions. He had his personal devotions in Greek with his Greek New Testament. And he'd find some fresh nugget and come to chapel and share with us. His heart just melted with love of God and love for God and love for truth. And he would just pour that out to us. And it would truly impact our hearts. I know many a time after chapel, one year especially, I had a free period after chapel. And many a time I would spend the greater part of that free period back in my room praying over the issues that were brought to our attention and were impressed upon us in our relationship to the Lord during chapel. But Brother Herron constantly kept before us the claims of Jesus Christ and what Calvary has provided, the judgment will require. And of course, we all know one of his statements that it's never right to do wrong, not even to get a chance to do right.
One of the things that so impressed me as a young Christian was the atmosphere of humility. And I think Brother Rob French, Brother Herron were men who believed with all their hearts that God can enable us to live victorious, triumphant lives. We can be sanctified, holy. Camp meeting was approaching 1 year, and Brother French, wanting to have God's special blessing on the camp, called the staff together in the library. And he said, I've called you together to talk to you. Now camp meeting's coming. And I was a young faculty member, and I was a little bit fearful because I thought, oh, what's he going to say? You know, have we failed? What's going on? But he said, we want to be sure that God is not grieved. The Holy Spirit can work freely. And so I've called you together to talk to you. And then he began to weep. And he said, I want to ask you to forgive me. I want to ask you to forgive me for failing to pray as much as I should. And loving as much as I should and caring. Then he went from staff member, faculty member, staff member, one by one, and took us by the hand. And he came to me, and he took my hand and he said, "Brother Whitaker, I want you to forgive me." And he was weeping. The tears were streaming down his face, and I broke down too. And I didn't know what to say. I was speechless. I wanted to say, "Oh, Brother French, please, just let me get down here at your feet. I'm not worthy for you to ask me. You haven't failed." But those were the feelings I had. And you know what? In that kind of atmosphere, that kind of environment that's around you, it's pretty hard to have division and strife and unforgiveness. Whenever that seemed to rear its ugly head, he and Brother Herron had a way of helping us to get through it.
I would say that, yes, Brother Herron himself personally impacted my life. I had the privilege of driving for him the very first year as we tried to round up necessities for the school. We would go to the farmer's market and we would buy coals. I remember one time we bought, I don't remember how many boxes, and put in the back of his 59 Plymouth station wagon, boxes of cold cucumbers. They were too small or odd shaped. But anyway, the girls peeled cucumbers, and we took a pickup truck. He made arrangements. We took a pickup truck over and got a load of potatoes. And then one time we got a load of cabbage. That one was really piled up, but it was cabbage. In fact, the manager of the farmer's market at Pahokee was a friend of the school and would attend services at the campground. And he was always, okay, after he became acquainted with us, he would call us and say, "We have a load of this kind of, can you use it?" And of course, they'd always use it some way or other. And we would go and get it. And then I went with him to buy textbooks. We would go as far afield as Miami, especially when we started the academy. And I had the privilege, I knew Miami quite well from having been through Miami back and forth going to Cuba. And so he would have me drive for him, and we would go to the textbook depository in Miami. And he always found occasion, he always found some way to speak to the person that we were dealing with about their soul, ask them if they knew the Lord. And his manner impressed me. I've tried to use it. He wouldn't ask them if they were a Christian or he said, "Do you have a personal relationship? Do you know the Lord personally?"
I did a lot of shopping for the schools. There was no money. We had a station wagon, and I made friends with Winn-Dixie, manager at Stewart, and A&P. And every time they would have a big sale, have some bargains, they'd call me, I'd go, and one Thanksgiving, in that station wagon, I had 500 loaves of bread. And I'd call Mr. Herron to see if I could pay a nickel a loaf for it. Did we have enough money to do that? He said, "Yes, buy it." So I bought all of that bread for a nickel a loaf. And they packed it in my station wagon. And there was only room for me to squeeze in. So I squeezed in and drove to school, and they unloaded it. And for days and days and days, the school had bread pudding and a lot of toast, everything they could use bread for. Because I had a whole station wagon full to the brim. You couldn't even, I barely got in the car.
And Brother Herron could also enjoy a little fun, but not too much. He didn't want to be too funny. I remember one time we set Phil Newton's Volkswagen between two palm trees. We just picked it up and put it between two palm trees where it would have to be picked up and moved sideways to get out again. And Phil came out and he was scratching his head. Brother Herron said, "All right, fellas, who did this?" And several of us had to confess that we had done it. And he said, "All right, you've had your fun, now take it out of there." So we helped him get it out.
He did have a good sense of humor, very good. And even when we were dating, he played a lot of little tricks, that sort of thing. We were driving down through West Palm one one day, and we passed a cemetery. It was a Jewish cemetery. He said, "See that's," I said, "Sure, I see it." He said, "Did you know there's a light in every one of those graves?" I said, "I don't believe it." He said, "Yes, there is." I said, "What kind of light?" He said, "An Israelite." That's the sort of thing he would do. He said, "There's an Israelite." When we were at Central, both of us, I went to Central because he went. Because Daddy, my father wanted me to go to a college in Alabama. And for dates, the dean had to be in the room. You know, they were strict with that. And in order to make your date last longer, if you do some little job after a dinner, then you could stay. So that night, Steve and I decided we'd do the dishes. They didn't have a dishwasher for all the dinner plates and so I would wash, put them in the hot water to rinse them, and he was to take them out, dry them and take. So I'd wash a bunch, and the dean was standing nearby, and he'd put them back in the dishwasher. I don't know how many times that night those dishes got washed. And finally, Miss Gibson was the dean, and she caught up with that. And she came over and said, "Now listen, those are the cleanest dishes I've ever seen, and it's about time we just put them up for good." But we got to stay a lot longer by doing, double duty like that.
I started in one room, and it was a very special room. We all had to move out of everything when camp meeting came. But I started in that one room. And later on, I bargained and got another room. We used became the first book nook. It was a little concrete block building. That was a music building for a while. Then I had the nerve to ask Sister French if there was any way possible I could use the old tabernacle for a music building. Uh-oh! Everybody said, no, Brother Coons, you can't do that. That's a sacred place. Sister French will never agree to that. Everybody told me that. And I went to Sister French. I asked her, I said, "Do you think I could use the old tabernacle?" "Why, Brother Coons, I think that's the most wonderful thing I've ever heard. To think that old tabernacle could be making music. Yes, let's do it." First time we tried to do the Messiah, many people didn't understand it, didn't know what we were doing. They thought we had lost our mind. They were very upset. They thought I was trying to teach grand opera. And I went to Sister French and I said, I believe I've bit off more than I can chew. I don't think that we ought to be trying that. "Oh, no, Brother Coons. We need some culture around here." Oh, I thought, well, I don't know how much culture we'll bring, but I'll never forget that. And she was an enthusiastic supporter. Sister Zook was an enthusiastic. I knew if I had those people on my team, between us and the Lord, we could do it.
In 1962, I believe it was, we had a real tragedy here at Hobe Sound. My Aunt Frances had come down, Dr. Herron had asked her to come down to be Dean of Women, and she did come for that purpose. I was very close to my Aunt Frances, and she and the girls loved her very much. My Aunt Frances was a jolly woman. The girls grew to love her. She would take them out for walks. They would laugh and talk together and so on. Very close. But in 1962, there were many immigrants coming over from Cuba. And my Aunt Frances had a heart for people like that. And so she was in a carload of people who were going to Key West with clothes and food and so on for some of the people fleeing Castro and his regime down there. On the way down, a drunk driver ran head-on into them. And my Aunt Frances was killed, I think, instantly. Uncle Rob was deeply affected by that. She had come in rather concerned, Rob, should I make this trip? And he encouraged her to make the trip. And he therefore rather blamed himself that maybe God was warning her not to go. We never agreed with him and tried to assure him that, nobody held her death against him.
I came in 1965, right after I graduated high school. I never thought I would come to Florida, didn't want to come to Florida, but Rob French had been an evangelist at our camp every other year for as long as I could remember, and they would bring Hobe Sound yearbooks and lay them out on a table, and I'd look at them and thought it looked like an interesting place. But when I graduated high school, Sister French went to my mom and dad and begged them to let me come to Hobe Sound for 1 year. Just a few years before that, Brother Herron had been at that little camp. And it was the greatest movement among the young people that we had ever had there, and he made such an impression on the young people and the parents. And my parents were quite impressed, so they agreed that Hobe Sound would be a good place for me for 1 year. I've been here since 1965, so that's about 45 years. Well, they wanted to start a student teaching program, is actually what they wanted to do. So Brother Herron asked Josephine Dye and myself if we would be interested in that. So I went into student teaching, not really having a whole lot of education courses. In February, Brother Herron asked me to take the second grade, which had been in with first grade, so I did that. My classroom was actually in the front of what is now the college library. Wasn't completed, they just put some plywood up and made a little room there. Then that fall, Mrs. Palm came, and that's where we got most of our education courses at that point. We taught during the day and took our education courses at night to complete our education degree. Probably, if I am any kind of a teacher at all, I owe probably 99% of it to Mrs. Palm and her patience and her guidance and her leadership and her advice and her wisdom during those early years.
My husband and I came to Hobe Sound in 1970 at the invitation of Dr. and Mrs. Herron. At that time, Hobe Sound consisted of Algonzinis out on the highway, a blinking yellow light at the intersection of US 1 and Bridge Road. There was St. Ange's and filling station by the railroad track, both of which are still there, I think. We did not have a bank, we did not have a restaurant, we had no place to buy food. We had nothing really except millions and millions of no-see-ums, sandflies, and mosquitoes. Church was held in what is now the cafeteria. The cafeteria was in what is now the community center room. And the college library was in what is now the elementary library. And there were no sidewalks, no communication connections. If somebody got a telephone call at the switchboard, somebody had to walk and get them or deliver the message.
I came to Hobe Sound in 1972 on a visit to my in-laws who were here on campus, and Dr. Herron asked me if I would consider coming to set up the business office. I was working for IBM at the time, so I went back and they graciously gave me a
year's leave of absence, and I came to Hobe Sound to work for the college, and then went back and asked for a second year, and they extended that, and then I had to resign at the end of the second year. So I continued at Hobe Sound for about 4 years, then left for a couple of years and worked on my CPA certificate, then came back for 16 more years, so a total of 20 years working for the college. But the privilege of working with the people that I worked with, the students that I had the privilege of meeting, and knowing that maybe I had a little influence on them going out into the Lord's work, were the rewarding parts of working at Hobe Sound for those 20 years. So the people are what make Hobe Sound what it is.
I came to Hobe Sound because both Uncle Rob and Dr. Herron asked me to come. But I also felt led of the Lord to come. Both Uncle Rob and Brother Herron independently called me and wanted me to come down. Not a whole lot was said. There was no criticism each of the other, but there was no question but what tensions had aroused. With a fast-growing camp meeting, a fast-growing Bible college and academy, and with very little organization. The organization was in Uncle Rob's back pocket for a period of time, and the finances were in Aunt Geraldine's ball mason jar, and that was in the earliest days. And it took a while for organization to catch up with all that was happening. And in that process, the rapid growth, there was bound to be, some were bound to step on each other's toes, and that was happening. There was no quarreling, there was no, those things were not happening, but there was tension. And each of them, from their own perspective, felt that I could maybe be a little help in bridging the gap.
We were asked to come to Hobe Sound to teach in the college and to work in the academy. My husband taught Greek, theology, and history. He continued to teach after he was asked to be academic dean. And then later he was vice president and academic dean working with Mr. Whitaker. My husband was a good preacher, good teacher, good administrator, and pastor, and later a good missionary. In all of these roles, he had the unusual gift of being very good at one-to-one counseling. I have had many people tell me that it was your husband who gave me guidance and help at the very time in my life when I really needed it. His door was always open. He had a very big part in helping the school to get accredited. And one of his major contributions to the school is one that perhaps only I know about. He was a man of prayer, and every morning at 5 o'clock he was in that place of prayer.
I came to Hobe Sound Christian Academy actually in the 8th grade in 1969, and from 1969 through 1974 was in the academy and graduated, and felt the importance of continuing my education at Hobe Sound, so I enrolled in college in the fall of 1974 and graduated in the spring of 1979. A year later I was employed as Dean of Men for 5 years and worked in the men's dorm for 5 years, over 5 wonderful years. Created a lot of great relationships over the years that are still maintained to this day. And then for 10 years I served as Dean of Students in the college. And again, those were some great years too, and some of the greatest moments of my life were spent here on the campus at Hobe Sound Bible College.
I remember the camaraderie that we had in the faculty. We did things together for fun, like the picnic at the out at Indian Town on the Wall Ranch. I remember the Christmas dessert party we had at the Seminole Inn. And I remember the many creative in-service programs that we had. I think of one that involved Ken Rice and an episode of Dragnet. The elementary faculty wrote, produced, and presented many fun-filled chapels for the students. I remember the faculty prayer meeting that we held in the college library on Sunday afternoons. We would gather and pray, and we prayed until Dr. Herron dismissed us by leading us every Sunday in the little song, "He signed the deed with his atoning blood."
My first 5 years as Dean of Men, I was privileged to work for Dr. Herron, and I remember one occasion where I was sitting in the Dean of Men's office, and he walked in the door, and he said to me, he said, "Addison," that's what he called me. He says, "What are you listening to there?" I said, "Well, it's a cassette tape from Moody Founders Week, and there's a black gentleman by the name of S.M. Lockridge who's preaching." And about that time, Lockridge went into his description of his Savior. And he says, "Let me describe my Savior to you." And he began, Jesus he's the way, he's the truth, he's the life, he's the Alpha, he's the Omega, he's my King, he's my Lord, he's my Savior. And he went on for like 5 minutes describing who Jesus was. And I remember looking over, and there's Dr. Herron sitting over there in that chair, and he'd become quite feeble at that time. It was one of his last years, and he's lifting both hands, and tears are just flowing down his cheeks. And we got through. It was a very, very special moment with Dr. Herron that I'll never forget, and I will count it a privilege to have worked with him and worked for him. And he, again, is one of my mentors and the people that were a rock in my life during some tumultuous years of my teens and early 20s.
I served as chairman when we were being accredited by AABC, and I don't think I ever will forget that last session that we had with the accrediting committee. The man who was the head of the committee was president of a Pentecostal Bible school, and when we had our last session with them, he said to the board, "I was walking around Hobe Sound this morning early and looking over the grounds and the buildings, and I was saying to myself, where did Hobe Sound come from? Why is this here?" And he said, "I went past the tabernacle and I heard subdued voices and went in, and all over that building there were people scattered praying. Some were kneeling, some were walking." And he said, "But they were all fervently praying." And I said, I slipped out and said, "That's the answer. That's why Hobe Sound is here."
I remember Brother Addison coming down to Seabreeze Camp, and we had the choir on the camp, and God blessed the choir that camp meeting. And Brother Addison came to me and he said, "Brother Coons, this is great having the choir here at Hobe Sound, but you need to get that choir out on the road. You need to get out up." He said, I want to be the first church you come to." One of the choir members was a former choir member, was a Greyhound bus driver, Howard Shook. And Howard worked it out, and we got a chartered Greyhound bus. Our first driver was Mr. Pat Moore, and he got saved on that choir tour.
Ponder Frederick was one of the first, not the first one to see the need. Many of us saw the need, but Ponder Frederick, his ministry was the beginning, really, of a pastoral ministry here. Not that he was elected as a pastor, but he began to meet needs that visiting the hospital and so on. So without payment, as far as I know, he began to visit some of the elderly people and began to serve as a sort of a chaplain pastor.
Listen to the story of amazing grace at work in the life of the man who would become the second president of Hobe Sound Bible College, Dr. Robert E. Whitaker. Among all of the things that Dr. Whitaker accomplished, the construction of the new administration building became the most visible physical asset of the school.
I got a phone call one afternoon from Archie Coons, and a phone call said to me, he and I were good friends. We in fact had worked together at the little mission church in the downtown area. And he said, Bob, I was just talking to a man who spends the winter in Hobe Sound, and he just came back, and he said they're going to open a Bible college down there in Florida at Hobe Sound. I'd never heard of Hobe Sound, certainly never had been there, knew nothing about it. And so he said, you know, that's something you might consider. And so he gave me some information, what little he had. I had met Dr. Herron when he was holding revival in the Wesleyan Church in the city of Louisville, and I admired him greatly. And when I found out who it was who was preparing to do this, I felt something of a positive response. Surely this is God's leadership. This is God's will for us. And we prayed about it and felt that this is what God wanted us to do.
Brother Bob and I started our sojourn together in what we call the Haymarket district of Louisville. It was an open air market where a variety of cultures. There were quite a few of the gypsies, a very, very busy downtown market with scores of people coming and going amongst little booths and little stores. And a friend of ours had started Skid Row Mission. So that's where Brother Whitaker and I met. Well, that's where I met my wife, too. I tell people I met my wife on the street, and I did. They got me to come to play the accordion for a street meeting on this Haymarket. All the time I was praying, oh God, don't let any of my university friends see me here. Anyway, that's where Bob and I got started. What a wonderful, wonderful time that was. And he went to Hobe Sound before I did. He went there as a student and acted as dean of men for a year, well, several years. But I came down the following year, I believe. I came down in '61.
Halfway through that first year, we found out that my wife Joanne was expecting our first son, and she would not be able to stay down in Florida for the balance of the semester. So Bob and Marcina Pelton were there visiting. They were our pastors from the Wesleyan Church in Louisville, and they said, we'll take Joanne home and you can stay and finish up the school year. Thank the Lord, we only had 7 months of school that very first year, and right after the camp meeting, and she headed home, and I'll never forget the morning when she left. It was very sad. As I came to the very end of that first school year and was anxious to get home and to see my wife, and but I still had this balance on the school bill, and I remember that it was around, as I recall, about $120 or so, I went in to see Dr. Herron about it, and he said, well, Bob, don't worry about it, because if you can find a job this summer and you can pay it off as you're able. I said, well, I'd like to have it paid before I leave. So and I prayed that God would help, and I was praying one evening, and the Lord directed me again to one of those great promises, Romans 8:32. He who spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? And I claimed that promise that night. And it was after that time of claiming the promise that somehow God was going to meet the need. I went to the prayer meeting that night, and this pastor, who was the husband of one of our teachers, Mrs. Syke, gave me a $5 bill, and I didn't know, it was folded up, and so I didn't even want to open it while he was there. But I got back to my room, and I thought, well, this is wonderful, but that's quite a sacrifice for them. And then I also received in the mail an income tax return, which was $80, and so I was making progress, and I thought, well, it won't be long that I'll have this. But it was interesting, the next morning, Brother Zyke saw me coming down to the cafeteria, and he said, Bob, do you have that money I gave you last night? And I said, yes, I do. He said, I want it back. So I said, oh, he said, so I got it, gave it to him, and he said, here, my wife and I were praying last night, we want you to have this. And then he gave me $20. A lady who lived in the community, a retired lady who lived right across from what was in the tabernacle, she had given us a check for $5 to buy something for the new baby when he came. And lo and behold, she called me to come by and see her. She wanted to talk to me, and she took her $5 back and wrote one for $50. So we had more than enough to pay the bill, and I had enough to buy enough gas. It took $20, I think, to drive 1,000 miles because of gas prices were considerably lower in those days. So that ended our first year, and then at the end of that summer, we prepared to go back to Hobe Sound, and different ones of the family said, now look, you're making a mistake. You've got a little baby to take care of. You have no source of income. How in the world are you going to make it? And we said, well, we're sure the Lord will help us. And of course, he did, and kept on helping us year after year after year, supplying every need just like he has promised he would do.
With Dr. Whitaker, I remember one time he called me in the office, and he said to me, Jim, I know your heart's in the right place, but you've got to quit stepping on other people's toes and mashing them. Well, the reason he said that was my personality is such that when I see that something needs to be done, I tend to get involved in that situation, whether it's my particular responsibility or not. So that's why he was sharing with me, which I'm sure people had shared with him, that I was getting involved in their area that I shouldn't be involved in. So that was a good thing for him to share with me, and I'm sure I've been guilty even after that situation or sharing that with me. But we had a very good relationship, Brother Whitaker and I, and still have a great relationship, and I consider him a real dear friend and a brother in the Lord.
I've lived across the street for many years from Dr. Whitaker and Joanne. They are wonderful people. He is one of the dearest friends I've ever had. And he is, I just think he's true blue. He's always been a Christian gentleman, and I've observed him for many years, and I've had some of his classes, at least one I remember, the Book of Acts. But I consider Dr. Whitaker as just a great, wonderful Christian gentleman.
Things changed through the years. We had some interesting experiences along the way, needless to say. But God blessed, and we gradually adjusted, and I'm so glad we stayed. I remember one chapel service when one of the students says, statistics say that those who start the first year in a Bible college will actually, only a very few of them will finish. He gave the percentage of those who actually graduate, and I looked at that and I thought, I want to be one of those. And by the grace of God, and in 1964, of course, Raymond Shreve and I were those two graduates out of that class that finished. But those were interesting experiences. I could tell you all kinds of stories about it, how you raise a little baby boy in a dormitory with a bunch of guys. We then had to move over to the men's dorm, and we were given a little room upstairs, which was a little better than just one room. They gave us two, and that was our apartment. And my wife had to traipse all the way across the dorm to go to the girls' side to use the restroom, and I had a restroom there on my side, which was for the men. But finally they put a door in the hall, blocked off the end, gave us a restroom, and boy, we were living in high fashion in those days. It was something to have. So anyway, we stayed there in that dorm, and I was Dean of Men until I finished school, and then took the position of Dean of Students, and began my years of teaching and guiding young men and women through the years. And how wonderful it's been to look back now and often hear from those who are alumni.
I always knew and appreciated Dr. Whitaker as a professional and as I believe, the Dean of Students when I first came here, and then as Vice President. And after he became President, he asked me to serve as his Dean of Students, and got to know him in a way that continue to this day. I have a deep appreciation for his integrity. I have a deep appreciation for him as a person and as a man of God. And in him I saw something that could be modeled where God would be glorified in a man's life, and he could face a lot of circumstances, still be kind and gentle. And Dr. Whitaker, you have been a bright light in my life, and a man that I believe that I could say that probably had one of the strongest points of influence in my life throughout my adult years, and I want to thank you for that. God bless you.
Property was made available to us. We bought it long before we started the building, and then we started raising money to build the building. Really a process of permitting and getting that building up. Retention areas to ensure that there wouldn't be runoff from our property onto the street, and sidewalks and other things that normally you just don't consider. All of that had to be done, and it was a lot of work, a lot of construction that before you actually began to put your building in there. Our neighbors on Jupiter Island were wonderful friends. They provided opportunities for employment. Many of our young ladies worked in the homes of the residents of the island. Many of the young men worked on the property, doing landscaping and various things. In the fall, they would open the homes for the residents before they returned, and some had positions where they would open and close those homes. It was a wonderful thing because it allowed the students to work and provided income for them that they could use in meeting their school expenses, and that was great. But another thing was the friends of that community who were so sacrificial themselves in helping us when they knew we had needs.
One of the things that impressed me about Dr. Whitaker was the fact that he had a passion for people, and he wanted to see us succeed. And while I didn't have much interaction with Dr. Whitaker because he was not a professor at that time, one or two times he substituted classes, but when I graduated, he wrote me a letter. And in that letter, he said to me, "Sid, we thank the Lord for you, and we're depending on you." And that statement to me was that the investment at Hobe Sound Bible College through the administration was repeated to me by Dr. Whitaker. And I'm so grateful for that because I had a sense of accountability to that, because he was depending that I would follow God's lead and follow God's calling for my life.
One of the joys of working as an administrator in my years as president was having such a great administrative team around me. Steve Addison, our Dean of Students, did a fabulous job in helping to organize student activities and do things for us that we had never been able to do, and did just a fantastic job. And of course, Jim Olson, our financial administrator, a wonderful friend, and did a fabulous job as administrator in helping us raise money as well as manage the financial matters of the school. And then Dr. Ed Palm, a real good friend, and how I miss him even now, after these years of his passing, but he was such a great influence and really did a fabulous job in getting the school's academic program on a good sound footing, and through his efforts that we've received our first accreditation from what was then known as the American Association of Bible Colleges. Those things, the love of God's Word, the development of a Christian mind, all of those things were the things that were stressed during my days as a student and things that were stressed as I was president of the school. Now as we look ahead, certainly to President Stetler, the responsibility is heavy. Bible colleges, independent colleges, are hard pressed financially at times, and the burden gets pretty heavy, I know, and the load is great. But God is still on the throne, and I believe with all my heart that He wants to do great things, and so that our prayer is that God will encourage and strengthen, and that the school will continue, and that many more young men and women will go from the halls of this great institution to become a blessing to a lost and needy world. God has certainly done that in the past, and He is the God of the past, but of the present and of the future.
The legacy of strong Christian leadership in higher education continues today at Hobe Sound Bible College, under the leadership of Daniel Stetler. One of the most visible areas of progress under his leadership was the beginning of the various music ministries for the community. Under the leadership of Dr. Paul Peake and others, the ministry of music was taken to a new and exciting level through the concert series.
Can't tell the magic in the air when it snows. Marvelous can't have conveyed the grace of the King. The only word for the
With the rapid growth of technology, Hobe Sound Bible College has moved into the 21st century by offering degree programs online. This has expanded the influence of Hobe Sound Bible College to the world around us.
I grew up in a Bible school context all of my life, and first graduated from God's Bible School in 1974 with a degree in music. But 2 years prior to that, something happened in my life that changed me forever. And that has a connection to Hobe Sound. I went to chapel one day, and Phil Newton and Mark Vernon were there to talk about Bahama missions. But in that service, I felt very strongly drawn by the Holy Spirit to Bahama missions. And after that service, I went to talk to Phil about coming to the Bahamas for the summer to work in their mission work. And I had school bill, I had other bills, I already had a job lined up. I talked to Phil about my bills. He grinned until his eyes disappeared, as he does, and said, "If God wants you there, Brother Dan, He'll provide for you to pay all your bills." And God did. I didn't have a way to get here, but God provided that. By the time I got ready to come to Florida, come to Hobe Sound, so I could go over to the Bahamas, my bills were all paid. My transportation was cared for, and I had enough money to get into school for the next school year. That first summer in the Bahamas was when God called me to preach, and my life changed. I went back the next summer. I was in Freeport. Both of those summers I was in Freeport, High Rock, actually Holmes Rock, High Rock. And the second summer I went to the Turks and Caicos Islands. Spent that second summer in the Bahamas, went back, graduated from Bible college, married my wife Joan, and we went to pastor in Middletown, Ohio. I wasn't back at Hobe Sound until 1984 when I was asked by Bob French to come and speak for camp meeting. My co-worker in that camp meeting was Wingrove Taylor, and needless to say, I was more than a little intimidated. As a matter of fact, I was very intimidated. I remember pulling up on the grounds in the commons in front of the post office, looking at my wife and saying, why in the world did I ever say I would come here? Got to service, looked at that tabernacle, and was overwhelmed. I went over to the little pink cabin on Sunrise and got back in the room and got on my knees and told God how bad I was and how bad I felt. I didn't even want to go to church that night. It was my turn to preach. But that night, God helped me in a special way, and I felt His help in preaching in Seabreeze Camp. But I will never forget the Sunday when my family and I went home from church. We're in the process of eating our Sunday noon meal when the telephone rang. And when I answered the phone, a man on the other end, whom I did not know at that time, Wes Knapp, said to me, I'm the chairman of the Hobe Sound Bible College board. We would like to ask you if you would consider coming to be president of Hobe Sound Bible College. I laughed. I laughed in shock and surprise. I said, well, I'll have to say this is a shock. And he said, well, I'm serious. Want to know if you will come. And I said what we're always supposed to say. I said, well, I'll pray about it. I went back to the table and I said, you're never going to believe who that was. And finally I told them it was Wes Knapp. They didn't know Wes. They said, what did he want? I said, he wanted me to come to Hobe Sound Bible College and be president. And they all laughed. And I said, no, I'm serious. And they still didn't believe me. I'll never forget, my wife Joan looked at me and said, you know what? I think we ought to do that. I was shocked. My kids were shocked. But in the next 2 weeks we tried to pray, and it was difficult to sort out who was talking to us and what was going on. And when it came time for Wes to call back for my answer, I got my family together, my 2 older children, and my wife and myself, and I said, he's going to call back. What should we say? My wife said, I think we should tell him we will come. My daughter Amy said, I don't think we should tell him we'll come. I think we should tell him we won't come. Paul looked at me and said, Dad, tell him to put your name at the bottom of the list, ask everybody else, and that'll give you a little more time to pray. The interesting thing was that is exactly what I felt like I should tell him. So when he called, I said, you told me you had other names, so I would just suggest that you put my name at the bottom of the list, ask everyone else, and I'm not saying if nobody else takes it, I will, but it'll give me a little longer to pray. If somebody else takes it, takes the job, then you don't need to pray anymore. God's answered. He agreed to do that. And so I went back to praying. And little by little, it became clear to me that this is what God wanted me to do. I came to Hobe Sound, and it was as though God closed the door on the past and opened the door to the future. And I had a strong assurance that has never left that I was supposed to be here.
I remember as a student in 1995 what life was like here on campus. It was a year of uncertainty in many ways. Dr. Whitaker had resigned as the second president of Hobe Sound Bible College, and he was transitioning in ministry. And John Basham was serving as our interim president, but we all knew that the board of directors was looking for someone to serve the role as president of Hobe Sound Bible College. I remember that summer I was traveling with a music group from Hobe Sound Bible College. And you know, you hear a lot of rumors, but that Sunday morning, just before we got up to sing and to minister, we heard that Reverend Daniel Stetler had agreed to come to Hobe Sound and be the new president of Hobe Sound Bible College. I was excited, for one, because the transition was over and the decision had been made, but I was also excited because of the reputation that Brother Stetler had as a man of God and as a preacher and a minister of God's Word. Of course, none of us knew how he would do once he got here, but looking back now, I can tell you, as a student, I benefited from his leadership. I sat in his homiletics class, and I benefited from his preaching in chapel. And I know because of his passion for young people and for me, that he was the right man for the job.
After serving as academy principal for 9 years, I was asked to serve as a college education department chairman. At that time, after 2 years in that role, Mr. Stetler came as our new president for Hobe Sound Bible College and Hobe Sound Christian Academy. I still remember the evening in the sanctuary of the CEC auditorium after church when we sat on the front pew and he said, "Clip, would you be interested in serving as academic dean of the college?" And I said, "I suppose I would." And he said, "Do you think you can do the job?" And I said, "I think so." And that's how the journey started. It's been a great honor working with Mr. Stetler these last 15 years on the administrative team. I have great respect for Mr. Stetler and his quality of leadership. He serves with a pastor's heart, and there's no one that I would rather go to than him if I had a need. I thank him for his leadership these last 15 years.
When someone looks you in the eye and says with great conviction, "God has called me here," I personally sit up and take notice. Many years ago, that's exactly what happened with President Stetler and his family. You could hear the passion in his voice, you could see the determination in his eyes, and you knew he and his family came to Hobe Sound to fulfill the call of God. And I'm really glad they did. I've been privileged to be here on the college faculty for many years, and they've been wonderful years. I've seen hundreds of students come and go and leave to touch the world for Christ. And that has been made possible by President Stetler and his leadership and his ability and stability. Who can forget his preaching and pulpit ministry? There's probably a lot of people who share my opinion. He's the best of the best. And you can almost hear him saying, "If you will, God will." As a friend of myself and our entire Budenseek family, Stetlers, we're really glad you followed the will of God to Hobe Sound. And may we have many more wonderful years of working together.
I started college here at Hobe Sound in the summer of 2006. I have enjoyed my time greatly here at Hobe Sound. I've benefited a great deal from many teachings of President Stetler and Dr. Kaufman and Dr. McElwain and many of the other teachers that I've had since I've been here. I do feel as I leave this semester, my last semester, that I am more than equipped for the position that God has for me. I have benefited greatly from the homiletics classes that President Stetler has personally taught us. I appreciate his genuineness and his heartfelt compassion for preaching to the lost and to the saints. As I leave, I just want to say thank you to all the many teachers that I've had for their time that they've invested in me and the other students that are here. It's meant a great deal to me to be able to come and to not only grow intellectually but spiritually as well.
Even in the face of challenges like financial difficulties, staffing, housing, accreditation, Mr. Stetler has remained steady and has been a consistent source of inspiration for all of us, not only on the administrative team, but all faculty, staff, and students as well.
One of the things I guess that impresses me about Brother Stetler is the passion that he has and the ability he has to articulate his vision for Christian education, for the student as they come here to Hobe Sound Bible College. And I believe in our movement, he perhaps is one of the greatest pulpiteers that we have, a man that not only believes what he believes, but a man who has a passion to proclaim it wherever, and a man that has a vision to see what we have today here at Hobe Sound Bible College will continue for generations to come.
We learned that sacrifice was not a sign that God didn't care, that loss was not that God had forsaken you, that difficult places in our lives were the things that would shape us and make us. And at least a great part of that came through the preaching ministry and the teaching ministry of Dr. Herron, who taught us that, and we believed it. Brother Rob French, also in the last years of his ministry, there in those years, was tremendous influence on us. His humility, his gracious spirit. That's what it was about. And I think that's what we tried to imbibe, and I think through the years it's held us steady. The most important thing with Dr. Herron was that you be a person of character, of integrity, that's what mattered most. You could be talented, you could be gifted, you could be well educated. But if you were not a man or a woman of principle and character, then what did all that matter? And he impressed that on us again and again through his preaching and his teaching, and it caught. And so through these years of ministry, the many years at Hobe Sound, 34 years of being there on campus and being involved, were good years. They were years of challenge, they were years, of course, of sacrifice, but they were years of molding and making us what we are today.
One of the greatest honors I ever had was when Brother Herron asked me to serve on Hobe Sound Bible College board. Brother Herron, of course, was a hero to me, a mentor, and became a very, very dear friend. And the 10 years that I spent on Hobe Sound board were treasured years. Connie Palm told me one time, he said, "I think Dr. Herron has the greatest input intellectually of any man that I have ever known." He was a man of sterling character. And Martha told me that after she left school, she'd really gotten away from the Lord. Had not gone out into deep sin, but had gotten away from the Lord, and I think was working as an interior decorator in a department store somewhere in one of the cities. And she said one day on a lunch break, she said there was nobody else in the lunchroom, and there was a pack of cigarettes laying there on the table. And the devil suggested to me, he said, "Martha, why don't you just take those cigarettes and just go on and be a sinner?" And she said, I reached for it and started to, and Brother Herron's face came up before me. And the words of that song, "I want a godly principle within." And she said, I pushed them back and got down on my knees there in the lunchroom, and that was the beginning of my getting back to God, and I haven't wavered since then. So I thank God for Steve Herron and Bob Whitaker and Ed Palm and Alan Brown and men like that, Edsel Trout and others that have given their lives in ministry here at Hobe Sound. And I pray that if Jesus tarries, that God will make the next 50 years the best that they have ever experienced.
I was up for missionary convention, and I was urging on the students of that year to have a vision of a lost world, and just to think in their minds and to try to grasp what it meant for people to actually go into eternity without Jesus. Well, after service, Brother Herron had me up to his house. We had a bowl of ice cream, and he said something that really impacted me, and I'll never forget. He said, "Raymond, you know, it's wonderful to have a burden for a lost world, but that won't keep you going. That won't keep you going because you're not going there because they want you. You're going there because the Lord sends you. And if you don't go because God sends you and because you have a real love for Jesus and are going for Jesus' sake, not for a world's sake, not for lost souls' sake, do all that you do for Jesus' sake." And that really helped me to reevaluate. He didn't diminish the need for a vision of a lost world, but he did say it's for the love of Jesus, because people are going to reject you. You go to some people, they don't want you. They don't know they need you. But if Jesus sent you, then you'll persevere.
Bible College is incredibly important. S.D. Herron saw that. That's why this place is here. Dr. Whitaker saw that. That's why he gave himself. And today, just as much as ever, we need a Hobe Sound. We need a place where young people can have their lives shaped and molded and touched by the hands of loving, godly people. God didn't call us to be phenomenally successful by the world's standard, but He did call us to make the sacrifices necessary, to have the passion required, and to have the vision to see the harvest, to let people know Jesus Christ and make Him known through our lives. And that's still what we're about at Hobe Sound.
The principles and values that were taught across the years and through the lives and leaders that have made up Hobe Sound Bible College and Academy continue to impact our world today.